If you're okay with it, I think we'll give Dr. Katie Paxton-Fear that additional time. Awesome. So I really don't think Dr. Katie Paxton-Fear really needs an introduction. She's kind of one of those stars that really just doesn't need to be introduced. It's like introducing Julia Roberts or someone else that everyone already knows. But for many of you, for some reason, have been living under a rock and don't know who she is. She's a lecturer in cybersecurity, speaker, and ethical hacker. Many of you know her as an amazing bounty hunter. I'm honored to be able to not only just call her a colleague, but also a dear friend. And welcome Dr. Katie Paxton-Fear to the stage. I hate it when people introduce me and give my bio, so I'll let Katie do that on her own behalf. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It always feels like stressful because I'm like, I must live up to this expectation. But I'm really excited to be here. As many people will know, I love API hacking. API hacking is my favorite type of hacking. It's my most consistent type of hacking. So I'm so excited to be here and talk about some of the cool bugs that I've found. So this talk is called Your Technical Debt is My Bug Bounty. A bit of a kind of controversial like title for things, but I'm basically going to tell you some really fun stories about some API security flaws. And all of these are genuine flaws that I've been paid a bounty for. I'm even going to show you how much I got paid for them. So you know that this is 100% genuine. This comes from like practical lived experience. So to give a bit about myself, because anybody who goes on the main stage of any conference needs to prove they're worth listening to. My name is Katie. I use she, her pronouns. I have a PhD in defense and security, and my background is NLP, AI, machine learning. I used to be a developer. I finished university. I was like, I'm going to go get a regular industry job. Realized I hated it, went and did a PhD, kind of accidentally fell into cybersecurity, and I'm not really sure how to get out. I've like passed the cybersecurity event horizon at this point. If you already know who I am, it's not because of my like academic work for sure. It's more about the fact that I make YouTube videos. I'm really passionate about education. I really want people to get into API hacking and hacking more broadly and kind of contribute, especially diverse voices. Because if we have a really diverse security community, we'll just find more and better vulnerabilities and we can keep people safe. And I'm really passionate about that, particularly getting folks from like countries who maybe have lower incomes, who can't really afford things like a formal education, giving them the quality education they need. So I am a bug bounty hunter. I found real security vulnerabilities in real software that likely you've used before. And that goes everywhere from like, I hacked the DoD. Yes, legally, they paid me a bounty for it. All the way up to kind of tech companies like Yahoo, right? So I found a really broad range of vulnerabilities. But because I used to be a developer and I used to make APIs, I really know what kind of bugs and mistakes I would have made as a developer. And a lot of my practice is based on that. So just in case you don't really know what bug bounty is, I watched this, like, I really like iceberg videos, and I was watching this rabbit holes iceberg, and, you know, it's talking about things like the Mandela effect. It's talking about like conspiracy theories, and it's also talking about bug bounty. And I was really surprised when this came up. I was like, is that an internet rabbit hole? Is it really? All bug bounty is I get invites by companies to hack them. I hack them and tell them how I did it. Unlike a penetration test, I get paid per vulnerability that I find. And if I don't find anything, I don't get paid. So it's usually open to like almost the entire internet. And the targets tend to be very mature and will only accept flaws, right? Like if something's best practice, they're not really going to accept it. They're going to be focused more on like actual impactful vulnerabilities. And if you take nothing else out of this talk, I hope it's that if you want to be a bug bounty hunter, it is all about impact. You want to scare your customer, the target, and make them absolutely terrified of the security flaw that you found. So this is a bunch of stories about API hacking from my time doing bug bounty hunting. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight of like how I work and the kind of security flaws that I have. Or if nothing else, maybe it will make you have the same realization that I had when I first started doing API hacking, which is that, oh geez, I developed so many insecure bugs, so many insecure APIs. God, I hope they're not still in use. And I checked, and the insecure APIs that I wrote are definitely still in use, which is worrying for like them. So this first story is called Read the Docs, and it's about how I did some really neat API fingerprinting. Now, fingerprinting isn't really something you do in APIs very often, but I think it's a really interesting kind of story of how API hacking can be really different from even something like the OWASP API top 10, right? Like we're often thinking of things like access control, authorization. This is more about supply chain security. And I know. You've heard a lot about supply chain security. Do you really want to listen to another supply chain security talk? Probably not. You're sick of them. But I promise this will be interesting. Just stick with me. So GraphQL. So this all occurs after I see a lovely GraphQL endpoint. And I love to see GraphQL endpoints. GraphQL is a kind of new way. It's a new way of building APIs that essentially creates a single endpoint, which can be easier for developers to manage because they've not got things like attack surface problems. But as a benefit for a hacker, you can actually get not just information out of these, but also information about the tables in the database and what you have to send to them, which makes it an interesting thing to hack, because in a GraphQL environment, you're often writing something closer to, well, a query language, right? So you can usually see these fairly easily. They have this really distinct structure about them. And also usually the endpoints start with GraphQL. So it does make it a easier kind of flaw to find. Now, I really like seeing GraphQL endpoints as a hacker because it's a new technology. I don't think it's that the security isn't well known. I think it's just the kind of race to production, right? I never blame any developers for any security flaws, because I think it's not the developers are intentionally adding these flaws. It is usually that due to development constraints, they've had to rush and just ship code and get it out. Anyway, so I was experimenting, playing around, found a GraphQL endpoint. Now, interesting enough, it was a multi-part form. Now, multi-part forms are actually, not very common in APIs. They're usually used for like uploading things like pictures or zip files. And you can see here, this is an example of a multi-part form. So the first part here has the content type application zip, and the second part of the form has the actual form, the data for it. So like this is the file contents. And I mean, they're not that rare, but they're certainly, it always sticks out at me. Now, what was interesting about this particular endpoint is it was a multi-part forming GraphQL. This was completely new to me. I had never seen GraphQL written this way. I was so confused. I was like, this is so weird. I'm seeing like a GraphQL query in some of it, and then the rest of it, I'm seeing like this weird variables files and like file content. What on earth am I actually looking at? It was weird. It was really weird. I had never seen applications built that way. And any single time I think something is weird, I know that I need to dig into it and figure out what exactly is happening. And I always say the first part of hacking is always to take a step back and look at how a web application or an API is supposed to work, right? Like just try the normal functionality. Because if you jump straight into run introspection query, run the queries, test for this, test for that, test for this, you're going to miss stuff like this. This only really happened when you are uploading a file. So again, super easy to miss. So I was like, what on earth is this? There's like a query, a mutation in, and there's like the variables are in here. Like what on earth? Oh, okay. So variables.file. Okay. So this is some kind of map, I guess. Oh, okay, right, I see. So this is the GraphQL query. It's then setting these kind of variables here. Down here, it's saying the thing with the name of 0 goes in variables.file. So the file is actually this part of the multi-part form. Weird. So when in doubt, we Google. And what I found is that this was like a part of a GraphQL specification called GraphQL multi-part request specification. Essentially, it's a specification that defines how you can use this kind of structure in a GraphQL environment. And it shared things like, people's thoughts on things. How is this working? How can we look at this? And I was scrolling through, trying to actually understand what I was looking at. I ended up looking and scrolling down the servers. Now, there's not that many servers that supported this kind of setup. But the question is, what language is it running? Because if something's using PHP, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. Python, I've got 2. C#, I've got 3, right? 1. So if I can narrow it down, I can start to look at what software this server is actually running. So I started causing issues here. And I got this lovely little error message that said java.util.concurrent execution exception. So it's running Java, which narrowed down the options from this big old list to one called GraphQL Java Kickstart Java Servlet. And this project is fairly active. So I decided to do some security research because I am a security researcher. So what I did was I searched for the word CVE on GitHub issues and saw what kind of come out. It's like a very basic way of doing research. But I should say, this is not hard. This is not something that was completely technical or hacker mode activated, right? This was Googling something and then searching for a known vulnerability. Anyway, so I ended up reading this kind of issue here, which was like 48 vulnerabilities from Jackson Databind, and kind of reading this. When I found it, it was before August 5th, so it was an open issue. Now, in this particular example, this is like an outdated version. Doesn't mean we want to say, it doesn't mean there's no issues. So I ended up looking into Jackson Databind. Now, Jackson Databind, if you use a lot of GraphQL stuff, a lot of Java stuff, you'll probably be familiar with it. It's a very, very common library. It has a lot of vulnerabilities. We spent a long time trying to figure out like a deserialization payload. And we had a look at like the software versions, trying to figure out what version we were on. Trying to, do some initial fuzzing and see what came up. Now, interesting enough, as we were kind of reading through these and reading through the issues, we ended up finding an application level DOS, aka it would crash the server. And it turns out that this error that I caused accidentally was actually it being vulnerable and the whole server crashing, which leads me to a lovely bounty of $2,000 split between me and a friend of mine, Rotem, down the middle. And that, I think, is probably the most technical vulnerability I've ever found and that required the most skill. I promise API hacking it seems super scary. It's not. Because now let's talk about a more simple vulnerability, right? Let's talk about CRUD. So CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete. And CRUD basically defines everything you can do to a piece of like a resource on a server. So you can create a new, you can read an existing or read all of them, and you can update and delete them, right? So think about, if you're on YouTube, you can create a video. By uploading it, you can watch a specific video, you can edit the title of a video. And this is usually formatted in APIs as this RESTful structure. You have, get API/resource name, post API/resource name, put API/resource name. You can also get API/resource name/identification. And it kind of has these really structured things. So when we start to think about CRUD in action, what we're actually seeing on the interface side is, a view button, an edit button, a kind of a delete button next to it. We're seeing like some information about a customer. Essentially, this is running in an API, yeah, but it's running from this like user interface, right? So if we look at the edit form or an edit form, right, we have like choices on what we can do. And the first thing we'll probably test if you've watched anything else is whether or not we can edit it, right, and like save it. And if we try that, we'll get a 403 error. We can't edit it. But think back to what we had. Though we can't edit that, it still populated all of the fields with the existing data. Now, on quite a lot of websites, you can actually make your posts private. And even though you weren't able to edit the post because it got a 403 because it had access control, it was still showing you all of the information for a video that should be completely private. So this is showing videos private. This is showing, the form. This wasn't actually on YouTube. I'm just using it as an example. But you can still see, oh, here's the title, here's the description, here's the video link, right? Even though it's private, you still have access to the read. And this is why I think API security and API hacking can, in some situations, be so hard to automate, because things like this would probably pass an automated checker. It would probably go, you can't edit it, tick. It doesn't think, wait, should I even be seeing the read on this? Like, should I even be seeing this form? And again, $775 bounty, not huge, but I was pretty happy with it. I can't remember what I did with that bounty off the top of my head, but the previous one paid for my trip to the US for DEF CON. Not huge bounties, not like life-changing amounts of money. And I will say, with API hacking, you're not going to become a millionaire. But what you can get is really, really consistent. And I think that's such a major advantage of getting into API hacking. So next story, I'm calling Quizzical, which is balancing the performance requirements with security. So this affected a mobile app. So an app that works on phones and on tablets. And often they have really interesting design requirements because the fact they work on mobile devices. Working with mobile kind of presents the developers with a bit of a challenge for a few reasons. And we'll look into this. And often these can be at odds with security a bit. So working with mobile, if you've ever worked with mobile APIs, you probably know how much of a pain they are. If you ever want to hack iOS, you need a physical iOS device. You don't have access to an emulator. It doesn't work that way. You do need like a physical iOS device. You need to jailbreak it. You need to remove the SSL stuff, the SSL pinning. It's a pain. On Android, you can run it as an emulator, but you still need to run your like routing and stuff like that. So you might think, oh, that seems like really easy. I really do recommend working with mobile though. That little add-on of like, it's slightly harder actually means that you can find some really unique bugs that nobody else finds because it requires a little bit extra. In quite a lot of bug bounty, I always say the main thing you waste is your own time. So if you do, waste your time, learn mobile, it can be a huge help. Now, because you're working in a mobile app, you often have to make trade-offs, particularly around network access. So the way phones work, this is from Google's like recommendation to developers, right? They ask you to optimize network access. And that's actually because if you keep on firing requests, you'll actually drain the battery. And also if they, haven't got internet access, maybe, internet access is patchy. And if you have to make one request every single time, you kind of don't have that optimization. And a lot of the ways we do this is through something called batching. So batching essentially sends, you can see here, our API request as an API request. So you'll get a single request to an API that has something like operations, and it will say, hey, this is the method, this is the API path, this is the headers, here's what the body contains, and here's the next API request. So instead of making both requests, you make a single request that then asks the server to make a request for you. Then you wrap the response of both of them in the response of the request, and then you can kind of have access to everything. A lot of apps do this. It's very, very common. PayPal does it. So do any big mobile app will do it, because then you're only making a single request, right? Thinking back to this, if you keep on making requests, you're going to drain the battery. You're better off making a single request and having the server do it on your behalf, which has some really interesting security implications. So this particular application was a quiz application, not particularly interesting, and it sent the questions to appear on the screen, but the very astute among you will realize to save battery, it also says whether or not it's the correct answer. So here we can see, what is the capital of the UK? Paris, Berlin, London, and then this is correct, false, false, true. The problem is this particular quiz had cash rewards for correct answers. And in terms of impact, the way you would do that is you would fire up automation, fire up the code, let's go. We would look at, okay, so we can access the API. We know how many quizzes there are. We can just cycle through every single quiz. We can get all of the right answers. So we'd need to run, several API requests just with that. Then from that, we then have to build okay, so when we've done that, we now need to make for every answer we get, quiz we get back, we're then going to have to do the correct answer. And then the point is, though, that's kind of easy to automate. For a developer, that is not hard. It is not hard to write a little script that goes through every single quiz question and just has the right answer. And because you could get cash prizes, you kind of have an incentive to spend the hour or so doing this. This bug is the fastest bug I've ever found. This took me 5 minutes to find. Now, there is an argument that you can make, and I think some people would make the argument that this is no big deal, and maybe it doesn't really deserve a bounty. I still think it's kind of interesting. I think it shows the trade-off that often developers make between, writing good code and doing security and doing things efficiently. Of course, this was a duplicate, but I did get a $50 bonus because the customer was very nice. But it was a duplicate issue in the end. But I think it's an interesting bug. Technically, I got a bounty for it, so I'm including it on the list. And those are kind of a broad range of the kind of issues you can find in APIs, right? I hope that I've shown you how easy API hacking is. And now I want to tell you the truth about API hacking. API hacking is not special. API security is not really that special either. There is nothing stopping you listening to me. If you want to get into APIs, to go and do so. You do not need to learn any special skills. It is the same skills you learn for web applications. They just look different. They have a different use case. JSON looks scary when you first start out, but I promise you, the fundamental underlying security issues are not special. They're the same as any other website in any other security vulnerability. Yeah, they look different, but the vulnerabilities are not widely different. We assume that they're special because they're APIs, and we're doing a whole conference about API security. But they really aren't something that's super special or a super specialized skill. You can get into it right now. And I'm sure a lot of you were thinking, but I don't know how to use Burp or Postman or the tools. You do not need to learn something new. If you are already in API security, want to get more into hacking, you can use Postman. If you use that every single day, you can get into it. If you're a hacker and use Burp and that's what you're used to, you do not need to learn Postman, right? You can focus on using the tools that you know really well and kind of focus on what you do know. And in fact, most JSON responses are also plain text. So not only do you not need to know these tools, you may not need to know these tools at all. Like, yes, okay, there are broadly skills like mobile hacking that put you in less competition, essentially. But you don't need to do something new. You can focus on what you already know. I can categorize my bugs into two broad categories. The first is issues between the interface and the API. The API returns more data than the UI shows, and access control. I promise you there's nothing else in that sentence. Those are the two main security flaws that I find. Something related to the interface and the API. It could be that the interface isn't stripping something, or it could be that it's showing more information, or that there's some other business logic in the interface, but the API is fine. And access control, that you can do something you weren't supposed to do. And when I think about all the API hacking I've done, those are the two issues that I see more than anything else. API hacking is more thinking than technical. It is not this huge technical skill that you need to commit to learning. It's just about thinking differently. It's about looking and thinking critically about how an API is supposed to work and what security implications are. And yes, there is an advantage to learning something like Android security. There is an advantage of learning something like Frida. There is an advantage of learning all these specific like API hacking tools, of course. But most APIs don't need them. Now, if you tell me, I want to learn, I'm going to tell you, fantastic. I have the resources for you. I have an entire playlist on my channel called Finding Your First Bug with an everything API hacking, which starts you off knowing nothing about API hacking to actually being kind of good at it and then becoming more consistent. And this is actually the first time I'm announcing this like properly. I am creating a bug bounty web hacking 101 free YouTube series. It's sponsored by BugCrowd, but they haven't really told me what to say. It is going to be a one-on-one course on bug bounty, web hacking, and of course it's going to include APIs, and it's going to be completely free on YouTube. There's going to be live streams and live classes. It's going to launch on the 19th of this month. Now, because this is a keynote speech, and I'm told I need some thought leadership here, what do I think is next for API security? Well, many systems are no longer designed. We do not have systems where some developer is coming up together and building something. They're kind of a mess of like APIs, no code services, maybe if this, then that, maybe some script that some developer wrote 10 years ago that is now powering all of how this system works. The race for new and shiny often kind of gets blindsided to security. For example, if your system is a collection of software as a service, where do you think your responsibility to your client actually starts? When is it a you problem and not a them problem? And I think we'll see weaknesses between services. You know, we looked at things like prompt injection between Bing Chat and ChatGPT's API like literally last week. And while we're sitting there thinking about how GPT-4 is going to change everything, I hope that in the rush to novel technology, people don't forget APIs. And actually, we're currently doing a study, like a scientific study, and we asked participants a lot about how they think about novel technology. And a lot of participants spoke about things like AI having security risks, and they could even highlight specific vulnerabilities in things like AIs. But even when prompted, they didn't think about how all these novel technologies would all be connected. API security is seen by a lot of people as this solved problem, or that it doesn't matter, or that it's not important. They're thinking about, you know, that data at rest, that data as it's going through AI systems. They're not thinking about transit. And maybe this is bias. Maybe we're just not asking the right people. We don't know. But I do think there's something really interesting here that people are not interested or not thinking about API security, if this is research you want to get involved in, it's like scientific research. It's sponsored by the UK government. We'd love to get more API folks involved. Please fill out the expression of interest form that's on the screen. We'd love to interview you, especially if you've got big thoughts about novel technology, about the role of APIs will play. And if I could just summarize my talk, APIs are vulnerable. That's it. That's the tweet. Send it. No need to worry. If you enjoyed this and you want to see more of me talking at people, you can check out my YouTube channel, my Twitter, my LinkedIn. You can send me an email at katie@insiderphd.dev. I have a Mastodon. If you're interested in sponsoring a video or something more businessy, you can do so at sponsors@insiderphd.dev. And I'd love to answer any questions that people have.
Hey, Katie, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm so glad you're our keynote this year. So so several questions. So, in my experience, a company has more APIs than they typically provide documentation for. What are the processes that you follow for identifying APIs in an environment? Is there sort of like a massive just spray and pray that you follow when trying to identify APIs? Because we both know, like, a company always has more APIs than they actually have documentation for.
Oh yeah, 100%. No, you know what? I actually, my reconnaissance process is hit buttons. Like, what I will do is I will go there and just try every functionality. I actually tell this to people who are like, I want to start API hacking. What should I? Don't go immediately to recon. Don't try and spray and pray payloads. Don't try and spam script alert one. Take a step back, right? APIs are fundamentally meant for developers to implement things. They are designed for developers to be able to read and understand them to a point. I realize that developers will often build an API, never document it, and then leave. Right? Like, that happens all the time. I used to be a developer. I do not remember commenting.
Usual, right?
Yeah, it's normal. So what I do is I just press buttons. I look at the functionality in front of me. I don't get caught up in thinking hacking. First step is always to understand what you're dealing with. My process is very much doing things like trying to figure out that lesser known functionality. So yeah, I'll do things like look at how you change a username and see whether or not it requires email confirmation, right? Standard stuff. But I'll also be there hitting, the hamburger menu and thinking, which of these functions is nobody looking at? I'll use an example, actually. I was looking at an email client, and the email client, if you think about, this is also true on Gmail. So I used Gmail example. It wasn't Gmail. So you would think, okay, I'm testing an email client. I'm going to send an email, receive an email, open an attachment, close an attachment. You can kind of imagine what that looks like. But here's a question. Gmail produces a little red unsubscribe button when you have a mailing list. How does it do that? What is powering that unsubscribe button? What in the code is making that appear? And how does it know? Like, what is it doing with that information? And it's asking questions like that I think is much better reconnaissance than just praying and hoping that one of the commands that you run work, like one of the payloads happens to work.
So you're more of a sniper approach versus shotgun and hope something hits. Got it.
Yeah. And I really do recommend that, because I think you're more likely to become consistent at finding bugs rather than finding just one or two.
And hope something works, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm a huge self-improvement productivity nut, as some people know. Do you use goal setting as a bounty hunter? Do you have a specific number of vulnerabilities that you goal to hit, every quarter or every year? How much of that have you really ritualized and making sure that you're being productive as a bounty hunter, and you're actually aiming towards something?
So that's a really interesting question. I think everyone has different answers. So do not take this as like people listening. This is not the opinion of all bounty hunters. I do not do this full time. I'm in an office. I have a regular 9-to-5 job. I do not need bug bounties to pay my bills. So I don't have that financial pressure of like, I need to find a bug. Now, do I put that pressure on myself? Of course I do. But I make sure I don't stress about it. And that's because I genuinely find this fun. I'm not doing bug bounties to be wealthy, because quite frankly, I don't really care, right? Like, I am happy with my current life. I do not need thousands and thousands of dollars. I do not need to be a millionaire. I find it really enjoyable. And I actually find the people who I look up to in like bug bounty also have the same attitude, which is not that I need to find bugs, but this is fun for me. This is something interesting. This is something engaging.
Yeah, trying to sort of put that pressure on yourself sucks the fun out of it. And
exactly.
It becomes more of a job than something that's a passion project, right?
Yeah. And I think that, with something like bug bounty hunting, you are working against hardened targets. You're looking at something that's already been pen tested, that other probably better bug bounty hunters than you have already looked at, and you're trying to find something new. It's hard. It's really hard. That is a difficult situation to be in. Companies don't have bug bounty programs if they haven't got like a really mature security team. They just won't. They just don't. They don't have the investment to make there. So in terms of how that kind of changes, you can't have that mindset of like, I want to find a bug every month, or I want to find a bug I've been hacking for weeks, because it will make you hate this and really hate it, and completely loathe it and make you feel super depressed. Though saying that, I will say I'm also a productivity nut. The best investment I've ever made for my productivity is this thing. So this is a Timula, not sponsored, but if they want to send me another one, please do. And essentially, it's this D8 that you flip on your desk. It's like a physical object, and track your time with it. So you'll see that I have a bug bounty one. So I can see how much time I'm actually spending looking for bugs and doing things like learning versus, actually finding them. And that makes me feel better, because I'm not finding a bug, no. But you know what? I've spent 3 hours learning a ton about this particular API. So it's not wasted time, it's learning time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you and I share that same passion. I'm obsessed with like second brain stuff. And I know you posted about that on Twitter. So some questions coming in. So Hamza asks, how do you recognize an API when you've come across one? Like, obviously, is it going to respond differently than if you've hit, just a web server running IS or Apache? Like, how do you identify an API in the environment?
It's a really interesting question, because I would say most of the applications that I look at, it's like, how do you identify the actual website versus the API? APIs are so common now that you've probably already used one and just not realized it.
No.
I spend a lot of time on mobile hacking though nowadays, because I think it's a great place to find unique bugs where other people aren't looking, and mobile apps are full of them. But JSON, whenever you see JSON, it's an API usually.
I would agree with that for sure. I feel like there's more of an attack surface there with the mobile APIs for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Over the past few years, have you seen API security improving, staying stagnant, or getting worse?
That's super interesting. You know what? I'm not really sure. I definitely think I see more vulnerable APIs, but also I wonder if that's because I've also become a much more consistent hunter, that on most APIs I can find issues. Hacking, at least the way I hack, is very much based on my intuition and like gut feelings, which makes it hard to teach people, by the way. Like, can you just download my brain and experience? So I'm not sure. Like my kind of first impression is, they're much more vulnerable. But I wonder if some of that is just I've learned API security and I've really internalized it now. I definitely think over the last 10 years, we are seeing far more APIs, especially in mobile. And I'm going to keep using mobile as an example because it's the primary. It's the primary thing I hack on nowadays because, again, consistency. You want to find a lot of bugs, and especially if you want to do bug bounty, you have to be quick. And so the more unique bugs you can find, the better. For me, that is iOS, Android. Really, if you want to get into API hacking, I actually really do recommend learning mobile at the same time because it's well worth doing. But I think I am also starting to see some design patterns really start to emerge in APIs. Things like batching have gone from like, here's a neat idea to here is the standard in which we do things. So I wonder if it's kind of become more common APIs, like it's becoming like the technology of the day rather than being more or less insecure. It's hard to say.
Yeah. So now this could probably be an entire presentation, an entire keynote on its own, but what's Katie's modus operandi for testing an API? Is there a standard set of tools you always use? Fuzzers? Like what is Katie's approach to hacking APIs that you sort of follow as a recipe?
So I got asked this once in like an actual interview with the media, and it was this very important person at like a very important like media op, and
BBC or something.
HackerOne had like got me as a representative for hackers with a bunch of other way more qualified people than me, and they asked me the same question. I'm like, chaos. I don't have I cannot tell you how chaotic my hacking is. I feel like I went.
Chaos was like a tool. It's you're just saying
no. Chaos. Just hit the button.
Okay, got it.
I think this is somewhat reflective of being like a bug bounty hunter rather than a penetration tester. But like I am the most chaotic person I know. I will literally be I will be hacking on something. I will randomly bump into something. I will spend 3 hours Googling it, reading like a research paper. And then, I come out the end of it with $1,000. Not really sure where that came from. So in terms of what I use, I kind of have the typical kind of bug bounty pacer, right? Burp Suite. So big fan of Burp. I actually spent 12 months using Burp Community Edition to see whether or not I could earn enough in bounties to pay for Burp Professional. And yes, I could 6 times over. And even then I was only hacking on 2 programs. So you do not need to pay money, basically, at least not initially. It's definitely an advantage. I had some issues, but I would say you can get started for free. I really like Burp Suite for all of my API testing. For mobile, I use an iPad mini. This is actually my new iPad mini that I got like last week. But I used an iPad mini 4 for a really long time. Jailbroken. So
I was about to say, I'm surprised that you pulled out an iPad. I was expecting you to pull out an Android tablet or something.
Well, yeah, the thing is that Android is really easy. I have an Android emulator on my laptop.
Yeah.
But I do find like while they both tend to use the same APIs, I do find that iOS apps are slightly more vulnerable. So I wonder if that's because people just aren't looking at them. But they also use the same APIs, so maybe not. But yeah, so I use an iPad mini for I use the Frida SSL thing to remove the SSL, and then something called SSL kill switch, which removes the SSL pinning. So they both work for SSL pinning. I use Android emulator, and I just proxy my traffic through Burp. It's super easy to set up, by the way, if you ever want to do like mobile hacking. It's much easier than it seems. And then I just click buttons. I'm not using fantastic word lists that is my secret and my secret sauce. It's often just, trying to understand what an application is supposed to do, understanding things like what the client actually cares about, because, clients want to see impact, right? I don't want to spend my time doing something that's not impactful for my client. And then it's doing things like, trying access control issues. Quite often I recommend using a spreadsheet, right? Like, I don't think you need to use fancy tools apart from Kite Runner. Kite Runner is a fantastic API. It's the only API fuzzer for like discovery and recon that I've actually ever seen work effectively. And
it even supports OAuth, the tokens, and
yeah, I know, right? It's so powerful.
Good. Yeah, no, I it's interesting that you said Frida for SSL stripping, because I've always used Frida for pinning. And so how often do you run into pinned apps? I mean, in my experience, I don't actually run into pinning that often. And I think the few times that I did run into it, I was able to do basic, using Frida, unpinning that. But it's pretty common for you to run into that?
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's really interesting. You don't find it very commonly, because I have it all the time. Though there's like
there may be a distinction between the apps that you're looking at versus the apps I've looked at historically, but
yeah, I mean, this is interesting. Yeah, I find it all the time. The ones that really annoy me. So the SSL kill switch is like a tweak for jailbroken iOS devices. That doesn't work on some implementations where they've used like a custom library. The only thing that works is then opening up Frida. I'm like, I can't be bothered to open Frida. Why? Just use Apple's built-in library so I can take it off more easily.
It is Frida is definitely a huge pain in the butt. It is. It's because you run. I mean, it's not a very eloquent, perfect solution. There's definitely.
It's a fantastic tool, but Jesus Christ, Frida.
Yeah, seriously. So do you get more excited about finding a GraphQL API versus a REST, or vice versa? Is there any particular thing that floats your boat the most?
I really like to see a GraphQL app with introspection, because it makes my life so much easier, because the reconnaissance is done. Saying that, everybody else now knows that introspection exists. So like, I'm also looking for those bugs that can't be found with introspection. Yeah. I guess it's kind of, there's a certain game you have to play with doing bug bounty hunting versus, I think, like regular penetration testing, which is that you kind of have to outthink your opponent, which is other bug bounty hunters, right? Because it's the first to find the bug. That's the person who gets paid. So there is a kind of rush to, you want it to be just difficult enough that somebody isn't going to bother and go, it's too hard, I'll just move on. But also it's not so like hardened that you waste hours of your time. There's like a balance there between, okay, yes, I want the recon to be easy, but if it's too easy, somebody else would have already found the bugs here. But if I'm kind of, the program is only just launched, it's an app that's difficult to set up, maybe it's on mobile, it's kind of worth spending that time. I don't think there's one that I really like to see. I think introspection is always cool. I like to see
now for our audience, can you tell everyone who may not be familiar with introspection what that is?
Oh yeah. So introspection is this, so in GraphQL, it's really cool. It's made by developers who like trying to make things very efficient for other developers. So it has this idea that you can't just query the data, you can also query the data structures themselves. So by using fragments and metadata, you can construct a query that instead of giving you back data, it gives you back the entire database and shows you everything you can do on that. So it gives you like, here's every query you can run, and here's all the parameters, and then here's all the columns that you can have access to. And it's very nice. And then you can visualize it, and it makes like a nice graph, which makes it really accessible. But you can kind of see by the fact I'm saying it makes it really accessible and makes it really easy, that for a bug bounty hunter, you're like, oh, I wish it was a little bit more difficult so I didn't have to compete with other people.
Well, final question, Katie, for the people in the audience who really don't know where to start, but they know that they want to get into API penetration testing. And as you said earlier, it really is kind of its own religion, if you will. What learning path can you recommend for them? If somebody wants to be an API hacker, wants to be you, what would the learning path be?
Obviously, the correct answer is to watch all my YouTube videos.
Oh, for sure. I always send you to your YouTube channel. Like, go check out Katie. Done. Period.
So my recommendation would be, if you already know Postman, then use that. If you are familiar with Burp, or you don't know, go with Burp. So learn Burp. I really like the Portswigger Web Security Academy for kind of introducing you to quite a lot of the flaws, and then you want to jump in. There is nothing that helps you learn apart from like seeing a bunch of different APIs in action, right? Every single API is developed by a different team with different priorities, with different needs and different requirements. And it's because it's developed this little bit differently, the way you've got to think about it is kind of seeing loads of different APIs and seeing how developers are the same and how they're different. And I really recommend, as soon as you can start hacking, actually hack stuff. Like, don't just think, oh, I just need to learn that. I just need to buy this course. I just need to watch another one of Katie's YouTube videos. Stop it. Just start hacking. Gather that experience, because that will be your greatest teacher. The sooner you can actually start hacking, even if you find nothing, even if you're just confused for 3 hours, just trying and just having that learning experience will teach you so much by the time that you can spend hours watching. You can watch all of my videos and still learn more in one session of playing around with an actual target. If you don't know where to start, Yahoo Mail, Yahoo run a bug bounty program on HackerOne. It's a fantastic API to get started with, particularly if you're interested in mobile.
Interesting. Yeah. So I know we're pretty much done here, but, I just want to reiterate, Katie, you're one of my favorite people. And, one of the things that I've always really admired about you is that you've always offered your education for free. You're not about profiting off of your tutorials, and especially this new free course that you're going to begin offering, I think is going to be a huge wealth of knowledge that you'll be passing on to other people. So thank you for everything that you've done historically and everything you continue to do to help further capacity building and API security.
That's so kind, because I feel the same way about you. You're kind of my API hacking hero as well.
Yay! Okay. Well, listen, thank you again. It's been a real honor having you as a keynote speaker to kick us off here in this new year of API security. So thank you, everyone who joined us. And you take care of yourself, Katie, and I'll wrap up here with a few final thoughts before I cut everyone from the stage.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Have a great conference.